Starches are the natural and primary fuel source for human beings. Hey, everybody, I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. This is one of those things where we've heard quite a few medical doctors and experts kind of say this over the years, but it's a point that people miss. And again, I want to be clear when I make this statement. I'm not doing an appeal to nature to where we say, well, if our ancestors did X or Y forever, that must be always what's optimal for long-term health. Because if that was true, then things like taking antibiotics and stuff like that wouldn't save our lives. So I do want to be clear on that. I'm not necessarily going to say an appeal to nature, but keep in mind people who make the other types of claims, such as, oh, humans are carnivores. We're really not. We're cooked food omnivores. At least our species, Homo sapien, right? They'll make those claims, but the thing is, it's not even true. But even if it was, we would still look at the data and say, what happens to humans when they eat almost entirely meat or too much saturated fat and no fiber and vegetables, right? It doesn't go well, irrespective of what those groups and cults try to claim. But when we look at humans, we look at our biology, we look at the fossil records, it becomes clear, and then we do see the same thing in the epidemiology, right? Cultures that eat starches as their primary calorie source, notice I didn't even say carbohydrates, I specifically said starches, tend to have very, very low rates of disease, low rates of cardiovascular disease, low rates of diabetes, low rates of cancer, low rates of obesity, okay? We see that repeatedly. See it repeatedly, and by primary meaning more than half of their total calories on average for that culture or that nation or that society is coming from starches specifically. But when we start looking at our digestive enzymes, our guts, even when we domesticate animals, what happens to them? It becomes very clear that we produce almost an unlimited amount of the enzymes in our GI tract to break starches down as fuel. In other words, it's very clear from our history that our ancestors ate large amounts of starches when you look at our biology and just our gut flora, our gut enzymes, everything else, stomach enzymes. And the interesting thing to note, domesticated dogs, which are wolves, that we have domesticated, when they are compared to wolves, I think experts have found that the same enzyme that we use to break down starches, in domesticated dogs, they produce it at 30 to 40 times the rate that wolves produce it at. Again, indicative that they've been fed tons of starches for thousands of years during the domestication process because they lived alongside us and ate our food and ate our scraps. Okay, so again, when we look right there, before we even get into anything else going in the body, we produce almost an unlimited amount of the enzymes early in our digestive tract to break down starches. We even produce them in our saliva. Okay? We as a species just naturally produce even the enzymes in our saliva to start breaking down starches immediately in our mouth while we're chewing them. Okay? That's important to note. When we get further into the gut, it's noted that other carbohydrates, we get further into the GI tract before we get to all the stuff that breaks those down, like that breaks down fructose, which is why we don't handle refined sugars quite as well, because they get absorbed in the upper intestine and we handle them better in the lower intestine. Same thing when we look at the enzymes to break down normal glucose, right? To cleave any additional glucose into its individual glucose molecules, the chains. We produce almost an unlimited amount of the enzyme in our bloodstream, but the one that breaks down fructose is limited. We don't produce as much, meaning it's very clear that historically our diet has, for enough to affect our gene pool for thousands of years, has clearly been highest in starches, and we're well equipped to handle them. Okay, then we get over compared to even other forms of carbohydrates. All right, we start getting into metabolism. Look at our cellular metabolism. Glucose is our primary fuel source of every cell in our body. Not only is it our primary, there are cells in our body, including our nervous system and brain, that absolutely require glucose. They cannot burn fat. They cannot burn ketones as a primary fuel source. We will die if our blood sugar drops too low, that being glucose. It is an absolute requirement for life, so much so that we have the pathways to convert other stuff into it. We'll convert proteins into it if we need to. We even have a pathway to convert a small amount of fat through the glycerol backing into it. Our body thrives on it. It absolutely needs it. Okay, it is our preferred fuel source. And what are starches? Starches are entirely glucose. They're glucose chains. So all your starches, all of the calories in them come directly from glucose. It's just bound together in chains that are then broken down by stomach acids and enzymes. Okay, a lot of the other stuff requires us to put it through a process before we can burn it for fuel. Other processes have to be enacted. And a lot of times we end up trying to make it into glucose. Again, it becomes extremely clear that our body preferentially prefers glucose in all the cells in its body. And before people say, well, maybe it's just trying to get rid of it, other than we have cells, critical cells like our brain, that must have it. If they do not get it, they die within minutes. They start dying. Okay? Kind of an important point. So again, when we start looking at this, again, it becomes abundantly clear that glucose is our primary fuel source, preferred fuel source for the human body, and starches are the one food out there that is entirely glucose. Right? And when we check the fossil records, what do we even find? The same thing. It's what we've been eating. Every single time we find, even Paleolithic humans, we find grains and tubers and other starches in their gut, in the fossils, every single time. We don't always find other stuff. We don't always find meat. Sometimes even the animal stuff is bugs. But we don't always find fruit. But we find these things sometimes, but we always find starches. It is our natural diet, is our natural preferred fuel source, and the same thing we note in the epidemiology. When we as a species, in groups, consume starches as our primary fuel source, we tend to have long lifespans and low disease. Again, it is very, very clear in every way possible when you look at all of this data that this is what our body prefers. It is what we have eaten for as long as we're aware of. All of our available archaeological records would indicate this. Our biology indicates this. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys and gals next time.